Hello, my dear friends. You are standing in the greatest repository of human knowledge ever assembled. The year is 48 BC. The air smells of papyrus and lamp oil and the sweat of desperate men. Your sandals slip on marble floors, polished smooth by centuries of scholars' feet. You hear shouting in the distance. The clash of bronze against bronze echoes through corridors lined with scrolls. Your hands shake as you reach for another manuscript. This one contains the only surviving copy of a play by Sophocles, a play the world has never heard of, a play that will be lost forever if you cannot save it. Around you, other scholars rush past carrying armfuls of precious texts. Some are crying, some are praying, some move in numb silence. The smoke is getting thicker now. It burns your throat and makes your eyes water. You look toward the main hall and see orange flames reflected on polished columns. The fire is spreading faster than anyone thought possible. Outside the walls, you hear the sounds of battle. Roman soldiers are fighting in the harbor. Someone has set fire to the Egyptian fleet. The wind has carried burning embers to the warehouses along the waterfront. Now those warehouses are ablaze, and the Library of Alexandria sits less than 200 paces from the docks. You clutch the scroll tighter. You have to choose. There are 500,000 scrolls in this building. You can save perhaps a dozen if you run now. Which ones do you take? The medical texts that could save thousands of lives, the mathematical treatises that took lifetimes to compose, the histories of nations that no longer exist, the poems that make the human heart sing. How do you choose what deserves to survive? The heat is unbearable now. You make your decision and run. Behind you, the greatest library the world has ever known begins to burn. You probably think you know this story. You have heard that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed in a single catastrophic fire. You may believe it was burned by ignorant barbarians or religious fanatics. You might imagine all human knowledge going up in smoke in one terrible night. This is what popular culture has taught you. This is also almost completely wrong. The truth about the Library of Alexandria is far more complex and far more tragic. It was not destroyed once, but many times. It did not fall to a single enemy, but to centuries of neglect, accident, and changing priorities. Its loss was not a dramatic moment, but a slow fade into darkness. And the world it represented, a world that believed knowledge was the highest human achievement, died with it. So, before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we will drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. The story of the Library of Alexandria begins not with books but with ambition. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC. He was only 32 years old. He had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India. He had defeated the mighty Persian Empire. He had founded dozens of cities bearing his name. But he left no clear heir. His generals immediately began fighting over the pieces of his empire. These men were called the Diadochi, the successors. They would spend the next 40 years tearing Alexander's empire apart in a series of brutal wars. One of these generals was named Ptolemy. He was one of Alexander's closest companions. He had fought beside Alexander since they were boys together. When the empire was divided, Ptolemy claimed Egypt. This was considered a rich prize. Egypt was wealthy and defensible. It had natural borders of desert and sea. It had the Nile, which guaranteed agricultural abundance. Ptolemy made himself pharaoh and founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries. But Ptolemy wanted more than just political power. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted to be seen not as a Macedonian warlord who had seized Egypt by force. He wanted to be seen as the rightful heir to both Alexander and the ancient pharaohs. He needed symbols that would demonstrate his authority and sophistication. He needed to make his new capital of Alexandria into something that would awe the world. So, Ptolemy began building. He built a massive lighthouse on the island of Pharos. It became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its light could be seen for 30 miles out to sea. It guided ships safely into the harbor of Alexandria. It announced to every visitor that they were entering a city of marvels. Ptolemy also built a museum. The Mauseon was not a museum in the modern sense. It was a temple dedicated to the Muses, the 9 goddesses who inspired art, science, and learning. Scholars would live and work there supported by royal patronage. They would have no duties except to study and teach and create. They would have access to every resource they needed, and most importantly, they would have access to the library that Ptolemy would build beside it. The library was Ptolemy's greatest ambition, and it would become his most enduring legacy to a world that desperately needed what he was about to create. Ptolemy understood something profound about power. Military strength could conquer territory, wealth could buy loyalty, but knowledge could create a legacy that outlasted armies and gold. He wanted Alexandria to become the intellectual center of the world. He wanted scholars from every land to come to his city. He wanted the accumulated wisdom of humanity to be gathered in one place. This was an audacious vision. Nothing like it had ever been attempted before. There had been libraries in the ancient world. Assyrian kings had collected clay tablets. Greek cities had small collections of manuscripts. Persian emperors had archives, but these were scattered and limited. Ptolemy imagined something different, a universal library, a place where every book ever written would be available, where scholars could compare different versions of texts, where knowledge from Egypt and Greece and Persia and India could be studied side by side, where the barriers between different traditions of learning could be broken down. It was an impossible dream, but Ptolemy had the resources of Egypt at his disposal, and he had an advantage no one else possessed. He had stolen the body of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in Babylon, his body was being transported back to Macedonia for burial. Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession. He seized Alexander's corpse and brought it to Egypt. He displayed it in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria. This was an outrageous act. It enraged the other successors. But it gave Ptolemy something priceless. It gave him a physical connection to Alexander. It made Alexandria the sacred city where the great conqueror rested. Pilgrims would come from across the world to see Alexander's tomb, and while they were there, they would see the library. They would see the Mausoleum. They would see that Alexandria was not just rich and powerful. It was the heir to Alexander's vision of bringing the world together. Ptolemy began collecting manuscripts immediately. He sent agents to every major city in the known world. Their job was to buy, borrow, or steal any text they could find. Ptolemy offered enormous sums for rare works. He paid copyists to transcribe text that could not be purchased. He established a policy that became famous. Every ship that docked in Alexandria was searched. If any books were found, they were confiscated. The books were taken to the library. Scribes made copies. Sometimes the copies were returned to the owners. Sometimes the originals were returned and the library kept the copies. Sometimes nothing was returned at all. Ship owners complained bitterly. Ptolemy did not care. The library mattered more than fairness. He also wrote to rulers across the known world. He asked them to send him their best books. He promised that the texts would be preserved and honored. He offered money and gifts in exchange. Many agreed. They were flattered to be asked. They were eager to have their culture represented in the great library. Scrolls began arriving from Athens and Pergamum and Rhodes, from Babylon and Tyre and Jerusalem, from cities whose names are now forgotten. The library grew with astonishing speed. Within a few decades, it held tens of thousands of scrolls. Within a century, it held hundreds of thousands. No one knew the exact number. The ancient sources give different figures. Some say 400,000 scrolls. Others say 700,000. The truth is impossible to determine now, but what is certain is that nothing like it had ever existed. Every field of human knowledge was represented. Mathematics and astronomy, medicine and engineering, philosophy and theology, poetry and drama, history and geography. All of it gathered in one place. All of it available to anyone with the ability to read and the patience to study. Ptolemy did not live to see his library reach its full glory. He died in 283 BC after ruling Egypt for 40 years. But his son and successor Ptolemy II continued the work. Ptolemy II was even more devoted to scholarship than his father. He expanded the library and the Mausoleum. He increased the stipends for scholars. He invited the greatest minds of the age to come to Alexandria. And they came. Euclid came and wrote his Elements of Geometry there. This textbook would be used for over 2,000 years. It is still studied today. Archimedes came from Syracuse. He worked on problems of mathematics and engineering. He invented devices that seemed like magic to his contemporaries. Eratosthenes came and became head librarian. He calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. He created the first accurate map of the known world. He invented the leap day to keep the calendar aligned with the seasons. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, 17 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilos dissected human bodies and founded the science of anatomy. Callimachus created the first library catalogue. He organized the collection into categories. He wrote summaries of each work. His catalogue itself filled 120 scrolls. These men and hundreds of others turned Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and the golden age they created would shine like a beacon for centuries before the shadows began to gather. The library in its prime was more than just a collection of books. It was a living community of scholars. Imagine walking through its halls in the year 200 BC. You enter through massive bronze doors. The walls are lined with pigeonhole shelves. Each hole contains a scroll wrapped in protective linen. Tags hang from each scroll identifying its contents. The main reading room is enormous. Sunlight streams through high windows. Dozens of scholars sit at tables copying text or taking notes. The only sounds are the scratch of reed pens on papyrus and the occasional murmur of discussion. In one corner, a grey-bearded philosopher lectures to a circle of students. He uses a wax tablet to diagram a geometric proof. The students ask questions in Greek, Aramaic, and Egyptian. The library is a place where languages mix freely. In another room, anatomical drawings cover the walls. A physician demonstrates surgical techniques on a cadaver. His students watch intently. Some take notes. Others look slightly ill. Medical knowledge is advancing here faster than anywhere else on Earth. Upstairs in the tower room, an astronomer adjusts a bronze instrument. He's measuring the position of stars. He compares his observations with records made decades earlier. He is trying to determine if the heavens change over time. His work will influence astronomers for 1,000 years. In the gardens outside, scholars debate under the shade of palm trees. They argue about the nature of the soul, about whether the gods exist, about how societies should be governed. No question is forbidden. No authority is beyond challenge. This is what makes Alexandria unique. The library is not just preserving old knowledge, it is creating new knowledge. It is asking questions no one has asked before. It is challenging assumptions that have stood for centuries. The scholars here believe that human reason can unlock the secrets of the universe. They believe that careful observation and logical thinking can reveal truth. They believe that knowledge is cumulative, that each generation can build on the discoveries of the previous one, that humanity can progress toward greater understanding. This is a radical idea in the ancient world. Most cultures believe that truth was revealed in the distant past, that the ancients knew more than the moderns, that the proper role of scholars is to preserve old wisdom, not seek new knowledge. But Alexandria is different. Alexandria looks forward as much as backward. And for a few golden centuries, it seems like nothing can stop the march of human progress. But of course, something always does. The first blow came in 48 BC. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey. Pompey had fled to Egypt after losing the Battle of Pharsalus. He hoped the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII would give him sanctuary. Instead, Ptolemy had Pompey murdered. He thought this would win Caesar's gratitude. It did not. Caesar was disgusted by the murder of a Roman citizen. He occupied Alexandria with a small force. He installed himself in the royal palace. He took control of the Egyptian government. The young Ptolemy and his advisors were furious. They raised an army and besieged Caesar in the palace quarter. Caesar was outnumbered and trapped. His position seemed hopeless. But Caesar was a military genius. He decided his best chance was to destroy the Egyptian fleet in the harbor. This would prevent reinforcements from arriving by sea. It would also create chaos that might allow him to break out. Caesar's men set fire to the ships docked near the palace. The fire spread exactly as planned. But it spread too well. The wind carried burning embers to the warehouses along the waterfront. These warehouses stored grain and goods waiting to be shipped. They also stored thousands of scrolls. These were scrolls waiting to be copied for the library, or duplicates being prepared for export to other cities. The warehouses burned. Thousands of scrolls were destroyed. Ancient sources differ on exactly what was lost. Some say it was only scrolls in the warehouses. Others claim the fire reached the library itself. The truth is impossible to know for certain. But something was lost in that fire, whether it was the library's duplicates or part of the main collection. Knowledge that had taken centuries to gather disappeared in hours. Caesar himself mentions the fire in his writings. He expresses regret, but he does not dwell on it. For him it was a minor incident in a larger military campaign. He could not have known that he would be blamed for centuries, that his name would be forever associated with the destruction of the library. The library survived this fire, damaged but not destroyed. It continued to function for centuries afterward. Scholars still came. Books were still copied. New works were still added. But something had changed. The age of the Ptolemies was ending. Egypt was becoming a province of Rome, and Rome had different priorities than the preservation of ancient Greek philosophy, a shift that would slowly strangle the life from the greatest library the world had ever known. After Caesar's fire, the library continued, but its glory days were fading. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC. The last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra, died by her own hand. Her lover, Mark Antony, had been defeated by Octavian. Octavian would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Egypt's vast wealth now flowed to Rome. The grain that had fed Alexandria now fed Rome. The taxes that had supported scholars now supported legions. The library was not destroyed, but it was no longer the priority it had been under the Ptolemies. The Romans appreciated Greek culture. Educated Romans learned Greek and read Greek philosophy, but they were practical people. They valued engineering over abstract mathematics. They valued law over pure philosophy. They valued military history over poetry. The scholars at Alexandria continued their work, but the resources diminished. The stipends were reduced. Fewer scribes were employed. The acquisition of new texts slowed. The library began to age. Papyrus is not a permanent material. It deteriorates over time. It becomes brittle. It tears easily. It is vulnerable to moisture and insects. The scrolls in the library needed constant maintenance. They needed to be copied onto fresh papyrus every few generations. This required money and labor. As Roman support declined, this maintenance became harder. Scrolls began to decay faster than they could be replaced. Rare texts were lost not to fire but to simple neglect. The political situation also grew unstable. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD was in crisis. Emperors rose and fell with bewildering speed. Civil wars erupted constantly. Barbarian invasions threatened the frontiers. The economy collapsed under the weight of military spending. Alexandria did not escape this chaos. In 272 AD, the Emperor Aurelian besieged the city. He was fighting against Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who had occupied Egypt. The siege caused extensive damage. Parts of the royal quarter were destroyed. The Malsion was damaged or destroyed in this fighting. Ancient sources are unclear about the exact fate of the library. Some say it was burned. Others say it survived but was reduced to a shadow of its former self. What is clear is that after 272 AD, the library never recovered its former prominence. Then came an even greater transformation. Christianity was spreading across the Roman Empire. In 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples were closed. Pagan practices were banned. The old gods were declared demons, and institutions associated with pagan learning came under suspicion. The library had always been connected to the Malsion. The Malsion was a temple to the Muses. It was inherently pagan. Christian leaders in Alexandria viewed it with hostility. They saw the old learning as dangerous. Greek philosophy asked questions that threatened Christian doctrine. Scientific inquiry could lead to conclusions that contradicted scripture. The mixing of different religious and philosophical traditions was seen as corrupting. Better to focus on Christian texts and Christian teaching. Better to close institutions that promoted pagan wisdom. This religious conflict came to a head in the late 4th century. The Serapeum was a temple complex in Alexandria. It was dedicated to the god Serapis. It housed a daughter library. This was a smaller collection that supplemented the main library. It held perhaps 40,000 scrolls. In 391 AD, the Christian patriarch Theophilus received permission from the emperor to destroy pagan temples. He led a mob to the Serapeum. They tore down the statue of Serapis. They smashed the altars. They destroyed the temple. And they burned the library inside. Christian sources celebrate this as a victory over paganism. They make no mention of any books. They considered the destruction righteous. Pagan sources lament it as cultural vandalism, but their voices were increasingly silenced. The destruction of the Serapeum marked a turning point. After this, Alexandria was firmly Christian. Pagan intellectuals faced persecution. Many fled to other cities. Some converted to Christianity to save their careers. Others retreated into silence. The tradition of open inquiry that had defined Alexandria for centuries was dying. One scholar tried to keep it alive. Her name was Hypatia. She was a mathematician and philosopher. She was the daughter of Theon, the last known head of the library. She taught publicly in Alexandria. She lectured on mathematics and Neoplatonic philosophy. She had students from across the empire. Some were pagan. Some were Christian. She did not discriminate. She represented the old Alexandrian ideal that knowledge transcended religious boundaries. This made her dangerous. In 415 AD, a Christian mob dragged Hypatia from her chariot. They stripped her naked. They scraped her flesh from her bones with broken pottery. They burned her body. Her murder shocked even some Christians. But no one was punished. The patriarch Cyril, who had incited hatred against her, was later made a saint. Hypatia's death symbolized the end of an era, and with her died the last flickering light of the ancient library's dream of universal knowledge. After Hypatia's murder, pagan scholarship in Alexandria effectively ended. The library, if any significant part of it still existed, was no longer a living institution. It had become a relic, a reminder of a past that the Christian present wanted to forget. For centuries, scholars assumed this was the end of the story. They believe the library was destroyed sometime between the 4th and 5th centuries, either by Christian mobs or through simple abandonment. But then a different story emerged. Arab sources from the medieval period told a different tale. They claimed the library survived into the 7th century and that it was destroyed by Muslim conquerors. The most famous version of this story comes from a writer named Ibn al-Kifti. He was writing in the 13th century. He claimed that when the Arabs conquered Alexandria in 641 AD, they found a great library. The Arab general Amr ibn al-As wrote to Caliph Umar, asking what to do with the books. Umar supposedly replied with a famous statement: "If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree with the Quran, they are heretical. In either case, they should be destroyed." According to this story, the scrolls were distributed to bathhouses across Alexandria. They were used as fuel to heat the water. It took 6 months to burn them all. This story was repeated for centuries. It became part of the myth of the library's destruction. It fit a narrative about religious fanaticism destroying learning. But modern scholars are deeply skeptical of this account. Ibn al-Kifti was writing 600 years after the supposed event. No earlier source mentions this story, not Arab historians writing closer to the time, not Christian historians who would have loved to blame Muslims for the destruction. The story appears nowhere in the historical record until the 13th century. By then it had become a useful propaganda tool. Christians could use it to portray Muslims as enemies of learning. Muslims critical of their own rulers could use it as an example of early Islamic mistakes, but it probably never happened. The evidence suggests the library was already gone by the time the Arabs arrived. Centuries of neglect, fires, religious persecution, and simple decay had done their work. By 641 AD, there was probably nothing left to burn. So what really happened to the Library of Alexandria? The answer is deeply unsatisfying. It died not with a bang, but with a whimper. There was no single moment of destruction, no dramatic fire that consumed everything, no villain who can be clearly blamed. Instead, the library was destroyed by a combination of factors over centuries. Accidental fires destroyed parts of it. Political instability disrupted its funding. Religious change made its mission seem irrelevant or dangerous. The decay of papyrus claimed texts that were not copied. Changing priorities meant new works were not acquired. The death or exile of scholars meant knowledge was not transmitted. Each of these factors alone would not have been fatal, but together over centuries they accomplished what no single enemy could have. They erased the greatest library of the ancient world. By the time of the Arab conquest, Alexandria was still a great city. But the library was a memory. Old men might remember their grandfathers speaking of it, but the building was gone. The scrolls were dust. The scholars had long since departed or died. The Arabs who conquered Alexandria found churches and markets and harbours. They found a city that had once been glorious. But they did not find the library. That had disappeared into the same darkness that swallows all human achievements eventually. What makes the loss so tragic is not just what was destroyed, it is what might have been. The library represented a vision of humanity united by the pursuit of knowledge. It suggested that different cultures could contribute to a common project, that reason and inquiry could transcend political and religious boundaries. That progress was possible if each generation built on the discoveries of the previous one. For a few centuries, that vision seemed achievable. Alexandria proved it could work. Scholars from dozens of cultures worked side by side. They made discoveries that advanced human understanding. They created works that influenced civilizations for millennia. But the vision died. The world turned away from it. Religious and political conflicts became more important than scholarship. Certainty became more valued than inquiry. Preserving orthodoxy became more important than pursuing truth, and the library that embodied the alternative was allowed to crumble into nothing, leaving behind only fragments and legends of what humanity had achieved and then abandoned. The question that haunts every scholar who studies the library is simple. What was lost? We will never know the full answer. By definition, we cannot know what we do not know. But we have clues. Ancient writers mention works that no longer exist. They quote from books that have vanished. They reference authors whose names survive but whose writings are gone. The loss is staggering. Of the Greek dramatists, we have fragments. 7 plays by Aeschylus survive. He wrote perhaps 90. 7 plays by Sophocles survive. He wrote over 120. 18 or 19 plays by Euripides survive. He wrote perhaps 92. The rest are lost. We have their titles. We have brief summaries from ancient critics. We have a few quoted lines. But the plays themselves are gone, burned or rotted or simply abandoned. Imagine if we lost Shakespeare. Imagine if only Hamlet and Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet survived, and all the rest disappeared. Future generations would know Shakespeare existed. They would know he was important, but they could never really understand his full genius. This is our relationship to the classical world. We see it through a keyhole. Of the Greek lyric poets, we have even less. Sappho was considered one of the greatest poets who ever lived. She wrote 9 books of poetry. We have 1 complete poem and fragments of a few others. The rest is silence. Pindar, Alcaeus, Anacreon, and dozens of others, names that meant everything to the ancient world. Voices that moved people to tears and joy, almost all of it lost. The loss in history is equally devastating. We have Herodotus and Thucydides. But we have lost most of the historians who came after them. Polybius survives partially. Livy survives partially. But hundreds of other historical works are simply gone. We know about them only because later writers reference them. The history of Carthage was written by Carthaginian historians. None of it survives. We know Carthage only through its enemies. The history of the Celtic peoples was written down. All of it lost. The history of ancient Persia is told by Persians. Lost. The history of pre-Islamic Arabia. Lost. Entire civilizations filtered through the biased accounts of their conquerors. We will never hear their own voices. The loss in science and mathematics is harder to measure, but possibly even greater. We know ancient scientists made discoveries that were forgotten. They calculated the size of the Earth. They proposed heliocentric models of the solar system. They understood evolution through natural selection. They performed complex surgeries. They created steam engines. They calculated with sophisticated mathematics. Most of this knowledge was lost. It had to be rediscovered centuries or even millennia later. Imagine if the library had survived. Imagine if the works of Archimedes and Aristarchus and Eratosthenes had been continuously studied. Imagine if each generation of scientists could have built directly on their work. How much faster would human knowledge have advanced? Would the scientific revolution have happened 1,000 years earlier? Would the Industrial Revolution have transformed the ancient world? Would we now be traveling between stars? These are unanswerable questions, but they hint at the true cost of the library's destruction. The loss was not just the scrolls that burned. It was the future that might have been. It was the acceleration of knowledge that was interrupted. It was the dark age that followed. Because make no mistake, a dark age did follow. After the library died, the Mediterranean world entered centuries of intellectual decline. Learning retreated into monasteries. It became focused on preserving old texts, not creating new knowledge. Science stagnated. Mathematics barely advanced for 1,000 years. Medicine regressed to superstition and prayer. The idea that humans could understand the universe through reason and observation was nearly forgotten. It would take the Islamic Golden Age to begin recovering lost knowledge. Arab scholars translated Greek texts that had survived in Constantinople or Persia. They preserved works that would have otherwise vanished. They added their own discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They kept the flame of learning alive when Europe had abandoned it. Eventually, these texts would flow back to Europe. They would spark the Renaissance. Europeans would rediscover their own classical heritage through Arabic translations. They would be amazed at what the ancients had known, and they would begin asking the same questions the Alexandrian scholars had asked. But 1,000 years had been lost, and the progress that might have been achieved in that time was gone forever, leaving humanity to wonder what heights we might have reached if the library had endured. The story of the library's loss raises uncomfortable questions about our own time. We live in an age of unprecedented information abundance. More knowledge is available to more people than ever before. The internet contains more information than the Library of Alexandria could have dreamed of. Anyone with a smartphone can access millions of books, articles, videos, and documents. We have digitized vast portions of human knowledge. We have created backup systems and redundancies. We assume that knowledge once created can never truly be lost again. But is that assumption justified? Digital information is fragile in ways physical books are not. A papyrus scroll can last 2,000 years under the right conditions. A digital file can become unreadable in 20 years. File formats change. Software becomes obsolete. Hardware fails. Companies that host data go bankrupt. Services shut down. Links break. Websites disappear. We call this digital decay, and it is happening all around us constantly. Think about the websites you visited 20 years ago. How many still exist? How many have vanished completely? How much information was on them that is now simply gone? Early internet history is already fragmentary. We have lost vast amounts of data from the 1990s and early 2000s, not because of censorship or disaster, simply because no one thought to preserve it. The Internet Archive tries to save what it can, but it is fighting a losing battle. Data is being created faster than it can be archived, and digital preservation requires constant effort. You cannot just put a hard drive on a shelf and assume it will work in 100 years. You have to migrate the data to new formats, new storage media, new systems. This requires money and expertise and institutional commitment. What happens when that commitment wavers? What happens when the funding runs out? What happens during the next civilizational crisis? We are one major disaster away from losing vast portions of our digital heritage. A solar storm could fry electronics globally. An electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon could do the same. A collapse of the electrical grid for an extended period would render data centers useless. A civilizational decline could leave no one with the expertise to maintain the systems. And unlike with physical books, you cannot just find a digital file in a ruin and read it. You need working hardware, compatible software, electricity, knowledge of how the systems work. Remove any of those elements and the data might as well not exist. We are also seeing deliberate destruction of knowledge in our own time. Authoritarian governments censor the internet. They delete information they find inconvenient. They rewrite history in real time. Private companies that control platforms decide what can be said. They can delete accounts and all their contents with no appeal. They can change their terms of service and remove access to purchased materials. You do not own your digital library, you license it, and that license can be revoked. Even in democratic societies, we are seeing troubling trends. Academic research locked behind paywalls. Important studies that few can access. Corporate ownership of scientific journals restricting the flow of knowledge. The commercialization of information creating barriers where none should exist. We are also drowning in misinformation. The abundance of information has not led to greater wisdom. It has led to confusion. People cannot tell truth from lies. Conspiracy theories spread faster than facts. Manipulated images and videos are indistinguishable from real ones. The noise overwhelms the signal. In some ways, this is worse than the loss of the library. At least in the ancient world, people knew what they had lost. They knew there had been great books that were now gone. In our world, we are surrounded by so much information that we cannot process it. We do not know what is true. We do not know what is important. We cannot separate knowledge from garbage. We have access to everything and understanding of nothing. The Library of Alexandria failed because people stopped valuing what it represented. They stopped believing that knowledge mattered more than ideology. They stopped supporting the institutions that preserved and created knowledge. They allowed short-term concerns to override long-term cultural preservation. Are we making the same mistakes now? Are we taking for granted the information abundance we enjoy? Are we failing to invest in the preservation of knowledge for future generations? Are we allowing commercial and political pressures to corrupt the institutions that create and share knowledge? The loss of the library should terrify us not because of what was lost then, but because it shows how easily it could all be lost again. There is another dimension to the library's loss that deserves consideration. The library was not just a collection of texts. It was a statement about what humanity could be. It represented a vision of different peoples working together. In the ancient world, most cultures were deeply insular. They believed their own traditions were superior. They viewed foreigners as barbarians. They had little interest in learning from other civilizations. The Library of Alexandria challenged this. It brought together knowledge from Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. It treated all traditions as worthy of study. It encouraged scholars to learn from each other. A Greek mathematician could study Egyptian astronomy. An Egyptian physician could read Greek medical texts. A Persian philosopher could debate with a Jewish theologian. This cross-pollination of ideas was revolutionary. It led to discoveries that no single tradition could have made alone. Greek logic combined with Babylonian astronomical data produced better models of planetary motion. Egyptian practical medicine combined with Greek anatomical studies advanced the healing arts. Different philosophical traditions challenged each other and produced synthesis. The library proved that diversity of thought was a strength, not a weakness. That different perspectives could illuminate truth from different angles. That wisdom could be found in unexpected places. This is a lesson we desperately need today. Our world is more connected than ever, but we are also more tribal than ever. People retreat into ideological bubbles. They consume only information that confirms what they already believe. They dismiss other perspectives without consideration. They treat disagreement as evidence of evil rather than an opportunity to learn. The internet should have created a new Library of Alexandria, a place where all human knowledge is accessible, where different perspectives can be compared, where truth can emerge from dialogue and debate. Instead, it has often done the opposite. It has created echo chambers, where people only hear their own views reflected back. It has enabled the spread of tribalism and hatred. It has made it easier to dehumanize those who think differently. The library represented a different path. It said that knowledge was universal. That truth belonged to no single people or tradition. That wisdom required humility and openness to learning from others. When the library died, this vision died with it. The world fragmented. Each tradition became more insular. Each religion claimed exclusive access to truth. Each empire believed itself uniquely destined to rule. The idea that humanity shared a common project of understanding was lost. It would take over 1,000 years to begin recovering it. The Enlightenment would eventually revive some of these ideals. The belief that reason was universal, that knowledge should be shared freely, that different perspectives could cooperate in seeking truth. But the Enlightenment also had its limits. It was often used to justify European imperialism. It claimed universality while actually imposing particular cultural values. It sometimes dismissed non-Western knowledge as superstition. The true spirit of Alexandria was more humble. It recognized that wisdom came from many sources, that no one had a monopoly on truth, that learning required listening as much as speaking. We need that spirit now more than ever. We face challenges that cannot be solved by any single nation or tradition. Climate change, pandemic disease, technological disruption. These require global cooperation. They require combining knowledge from different fields and cultures. They require setting aside tribal loyalties in service of common survival. The Library of Alexandria showed that this was possible. For a few centuries, scholars from dozens of backgrounds worked together. They created an institution that served all of humanity. They advanced knowledge in ways that benefited everyone. They proved that our differences could be sources of strength. When we lost the library, we lost more than books. We lost a working model of how humanity could cooperate. We lost proof that it was possible to build institutions dedicated to truth rather than power. We lost a vision of what we could become. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that we still have not fully recovered what was lost in those flames. Some historians argue that we romanticized the Library of Alexandria. They point out that it was not as egalitarian as we imagine. Scholarship there was reserved for an elite. The vast majority of people were illiterate. They had no access to the knowledge stored in the library. The library served the interests of the ruling class. It legitimized Ptolemaic rule. It trained administrators for the empire. It created technologies of warfare and control. Much of the knowledge gathered there was used to exploit and dominate. These criticisms have merit. The library was a product of its time. It reflected the values and limitations of ancient society. It was funded by wealth extracted from peasants and slaves. The scholars who worked there depended on a system of profound inequality. But acknowledging these truths does not negate the library's significance. Flawed institutions can still represent important ideals. The library at its best embodied principles that transcended its particular circumstances. The belief that knowledge was valuable for its own sake. The conviction that truth could be discovered through careful study. The recognition that different traditions had insights worth preserving. These ideas were revolutionary in the ancient world. They are still radical today. And they are ideas we need to defend. Because the forces that destroyed the library still exist. The belief that ideology matters more than truth. The conviction that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. The fear of ideas that challenge established power. The willingness to sacrifice long-term cultural heritage for short-term political gain. These destroyed the library, and they threaten our knowledge institutions today. Universities are under attack in many countries. Scholars are censored or imprisoned for their research. Libraries are defunded. Archives are destroyed. Museums are looted. Scientists are pressured to produce results that support political narratives. Historians are told to avoid inconvenient truths. Teachers are forbidden from discussing certain topics. This is happening not just in authoritarian states. It is happening in democracies. It is happening wherever people decide that controlling information is more important than preserving it. The pattern is always the same. First comes the claim that certain knowledge is harmful, that it corrupts morals or threatens social order, that protecting people from it is more important than preserving it. Then comes censorship, subtle at first. Certain books quietly removed from libraries, certain topics avoided in classrooms, certain perspectives excluded from media. Then comes more overt suppression, laws against teaching or publishing certain ideas, punishment for scholars who violate the new orthodoxies, destruction of materials deemed dangerous. Finally comes the burning, sometimes literal, sometimes figurative through neglect and defunding. But the result is the same. Knowledge is lost, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. This happened to the Library of Alexandria. Different groups at different times decided it represented something they opposed. Pagan knowledge in a Christian world. Greek philosophy in a world turning toward revelation. Expensive institutions in a world of declining resources. Each time the library represented something valuable, but something that those in power decided was expendable. And bit by bit, the library died. We tell ourselves we are different. We tell ourselves we value knowledge too much to let this happen. But are we? Every time we allow political pressure to influence scientific research, we move closer. Every time we defund institutions that preserve knowledge, we move closer. Every time we prioritize short-term concerns over long-term cultural preservation, we move closer. Every time we decide that some truths are too dangerous to discuss, we move closer. The library was not destroyed by its enemies alone. It was destroyed by the indifference of those who should have defended it. By people who thought other things were more important. By those who could not imagine a world without it until it was gone. We are those people now. We cannot imagine losing the knowledge we have accumulated. It seems impossible in our connected world. But so did the loss of the library to those who lived when it still stood. And they were wrong. Let us imagine for a moment that the library had survived. Not just survived, but continued to grow. Imagine if the tradition of scholarship it established had never been broken. What would our world look like now? This is speculative, of course. History does not work in straight lines. The survival of the library would not have prevented all human conflict. It would not have created a utopia, but it might have changed things in profound ways. If the library had continued, the scientific knowledge of the ancient world might never have been lost. Medieval Europe would not have spent centuries in scientific darkness. The Islamic Golden Age might have started earlier and lasted longer. The Renaissance might have been unnecessary because there would have been no need to rediscover lost knowledge. The scientific revolution might have happened 1,000 years earlier. Imagine 19th century technology in the 9th century. Imagine 20th century knowledge in the 10th century. The diseases that killed millions might have been cured. The poverty that crushed billions might have been relieved. The wars fought over resources that science could have created might never have happened. This is possibly too optimistic. Human nature being what it is, we likely would have found new reasons for conflict. New technologies can be used for destruction as easily as creation, but it is undeniable that the loss of knowledge set humanity back. The centuries spent recovering what had been lost were centuries that could have been spent advancing. Every generation had to relearn what previous generations had known. Every discovery had to be made twice. Once in Alexandria, once again, after it was forgotten. This is the real cost of the library's destruction. Not just what was lost, but what could have been gained. The survival of the library would also have meant the survival of its values, the commitment to reason and evidence, the openness to different perspectives, the belief in the unity of human knowledge. If these values had been continuously transmitted, they might have become more deeply rooted in human culture. The religious conflicts that tore apart the medieval world might have been less severe. The tribal hatreds that fuel modern conflicts might have been weaker. The institutions of science and scholarship might have been stronger and more resistant to political pressure. Again, this may be wishful thinking, but institutions and values do shape society over time. The library represented a different way of thinking about knowledge. If that way of thinking had survived unbroken, it would have influenced how societies developed. Some historians argue that the library's destruction was inevitable, that it was doomed by forces beyond anyone's control. The decline of the ancient world, the rise of new religions, the economic collapse of the Roman Empire, the technological limitations of papyrus and manual copying. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps no amount of commitment could have saved the library, but I am not convinced. The library survived for over 600 years. It weathered many crises. It might have weathered more. What doomed it was not inevitable historical forces. It was human choices, the choice to burn ships in the harbor without considering what else might catch fire, the choice to prioritize religious orthodoxy over intellectual inquiry, the choice to defund institutions that did not serve immediate political needs, the choice to destroy temples that housed books, the choice to persecute scholars who represented the old learning. Each of these was a choice. Each could have been made differently. The library did not have to die. We let it die. And we have been paying the price ever since. This brings us to the question that matters most. Not what happened to the Library of Alexandria, but what we will do with the libraries we have now. Will we defend them when they come under attack? Will we fund them adequately so they can preserve knowledge for future generations? Will we resist the temptation to censor materials we disagree with? Will we teach our children to value knowledge for its own sake? Will we build institutions that can outlast us? Or will we allow short-term thinking to doom our cultural heritage as it doomed Alexandria? The choice is ours as it was theirs, and future generations will judge us by how we answer. There is a story told about the last day of the library. It is almost certainly fictional, but it captures something true about the loss. An old scholar stands in the reading room. He has spent his entire life here, 50 years of studying ancient texts. He has written commentaries on Aristotle. He has copied the works of poets whose names no one remembers anymore. He has taught students who have gone on to become teachers themselves. Now he stands alone. The other scholars have fled. The students have not come in months. The funding has stopped. The staff has been dismissed. The doors will not open again. He looks around at the scrolls. Thousands of them. The accumulated wisdom of centuries. He knows he cannot save them all. He can carry perhaps 5 scrolls. Maybe 10 if he is willing to abandon everything else. Which ones does he choose? The mathematical works that represent decades of calculations. The philosophical dialogues that still speak across centuries. The histories of nations that exist now only in these pages. The poems that capture the human heart in ways nothing else can. How does he decide? He reaches for one scroll, then another, then he stops. It does not matter which ones he saves. Saving 10 scrolls from a library of 500,000 is meaningless. It is like saving 10 people from a city of millions. The loss is still catastrophic. He sits down. He unrolls one of his favorite texts, a dialogue by Plato. He begins to read. If this is the last time anyone will read these words, he will read them carefully. He will honor them with his attention. He will remember them, even if no one else will. Hours pass. The light fades. He can barely see the words now, but he has memorized them over the years. He speaks them aloud to the empty room. The words echo off the marble walls. They hang in the air for a moment. Then they fade. The scholar closes the scroll. He places it gently back on the shelf. He stands and walks to the door. He does not look back. He cannot bear to. He steps outside. He closes the door behind him. It is the last time it will ever open. This story is fiction. We do not know if anything like this happened, but it represents the emotional truth of the loss. Someone was the last person to read each of those scrolls. Someone was the last to speak words that had been spoken for centuries. Someone had to make the choice to walk away knowing everything would be lost. That moment has happened over and over throughout history. The last speaker of a language dying with no one to pass it on to. The last practitioner of a craft with no apprentice. The last keeper of a tradition that will now be forgotten. Every time knowledge dies, it dies because someone chose not to preserve it. Or could not preserve it. Or was prevented from preserving it. The Library of Alexandria is unique only in scale. The pattern is universal. We are living through our own versions of this story right now. Indigenous languages are dying at an alarming rate. Traditional knowledge systems are being lost. Oral histories are fading as the elders who remember them pass away. Physical archives are deteriorating faster than they can be digitized. Digital materials are vanishing as formats become obsolete. Entire fields of expertise are at risk as funding dries up and students choose more profitable careers. Each loss is a small Alexandria. Each represents knowledge that took generations to accumulate. Each is irreplaceable once gone, and each happens because we collectively decide it is not worth the effort to preserve. The scholar in the story faced an impossible choice. We face a different but related choice. We have the resources to preserve far more than previous generations could. We have technology that makes preservation easier. We have wealth that previous ages could not imagine. The question is whether we will use these resources for preservation, or whether we will let knowledge slip away because we are too distracted or too indifferent to defend it. If we learned anything from the loss of the Library of Alexandria, it should be this. Preservation requires active effort. Knowledge does not preserve itself. It requires institutions. It requires funding. It requires people dedicated to the task. It requires a cultural commitment that transcends generations. The library worked because generations of rulers supported it. They allocated resources even when they could have been used elsewhere. They protected scholars even when their work seemed impractical. They collected texts even when they could not immediately see the value. They thought in terms of centuries, not quarters. They built for their great-grandchildren, not just for themselves. When that commitment wavered, the library began to die. When it disappeared entirely, the library could not survive. We need that same long-term commitment today. Our libraries and archives and museums need consistent support, not just when it is politically convenient, not just when the economy is strong, always. Because once knowledge is lost, it is almost impossible to recover. We also need to resist the politicization of knowledge. The library died in part because it became associated with paganism. Christian authorities saw it as an enemy institution. They could not separate the knowledge it contained from the religious context in which it had been gathered. So they destroyed or abandoned it. We make the same mistake when we treat knowledge institutions as political actors. When we defund universities because we disagree with some faculty members. When we attack museums because we dislike how they present history. When we censor libraries because they contain books we find offensive. Knowledge institutions should be sites of debate. They should present multiple perspectives. They should challenge assumptions. This is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. The alternative is institutions that only preserve politically approved knowledge, that only present officially sanctioned narratives, that serve power rather than truth. These are not knowledge institutions, they are propaganda organs. The Library of Alexandria at its best served knowledge, not power. It preserved texts its patrons disagreed with. It allowed debates that challenged political authority. It recognized that truth was more important than comfort. We need to recover that spirit. We need libraries that collect materials regardless of political correctness. We need archives that preserve records even when they reflect badly on our ancestors. We need museums that present complex and sometimes uncomfortable histories. We need universities where unpopular ideas can be debated. This does not mean giving platforms to hate or violence, but it means recognizing that knowledge requires intellectual freedom, that preservation means saving things we might not personally value, that future generations should be able to judge the past for themselves. The scholars who burned the Serapeum believed they were doing right. They believed pagan knowledge was corrupting, that it led people away from truth, that destroying it would make society better. They were wrong. They destroyed knowledge that could never be recovered. They impoverished human culture. They set back human progress. We should learn from their mistake. We should be humble about our ability to judge what future generations will value. We should preserve broadly rather than selectively. We should err on the side of inclusion, because we cannot know what will prove important. A text that seems worthless today might unlock discoveries tomorrow. A perspective that seems wrong might contain insights we are missing. A tradition that seems outdated might preserve knowledge we need. The library understood this. It collected everything. It let scholars decide what was valuable. It trusted that truth would emerge from free inquiry. We have lost that trust. We want to control knowledge, to decide in advance what should be preserved and what should be forgotten, to shape the historical record to support our preferred narratives. This is the path to a new dark age, not because all knowledge will be lost, but because only politically acceptable knowledge will survive. And that is not knowledge at all, but merely propaganda with footnotes. There is a profound irony in how we remember the Library of Alexandria. We remember it as a temple of knowledge, as the greatest library in history, as a symbol of all that humanity lost in the fall of the ancient world. But we do not actually know that much about it. Most of what we think we know is speculation. We do not know exactly when it was founded. We do not know its precise location. We do not know how it was organized. We do not know how many scrolls it truly contained. We do not know what most of those scrolls were. We do not even know for certain how it was destroyed. The library has become a legend, a story we tell ourselves about the fragility of knowledge. The actual historical reality is murky and debated. This is fitting in a way. The library is lost even in memory. We cannot fully reconstruct what it was. We can only imagine it. And in our imagining, we reveal what we value. When we speak of the library, we are really speaking about ourselves, about our own fears of loss, about our own hopes for preservation, about our own beliefs about what knowledge means. Some see the library as a warning about religious fanaticism. They emphasize the Christian destruction of pagan learning. They use it to argue against religious influence in public life. Others see it as a warning about political instability. They emphasize the fires and wars that damaged it. They use it to argue for strong institutions and social order. Still others see it as a warning about technological fragility. They emphasize the decay of papyrus and the difficulty of preservation. They use it to argue for digital archiving and redundancy. All of these interpretations have some validity. All capture part of what the library's loss means, but none captures the whole truth, because the truth is that the library was lost through a combination of factors, and it could happen again through any number of parts. The important question is not exactly how it happened. The important question is whether we are vulnerable to the same loss. And the answer is clearly yes. Our knowledge systems are more extensive than anything Alexandria achieved, but they are also more fragile in some ways, more dependent on technology that can fail, more vulnerable to disruption of complex supply chains, more threatened by the polarization that makes collective action difficult, more at risk from those who see knowledge as a threat to their power. The library fell because the civilization that supported it changed. The values that created the library were replaced by different values. The institution could not survive that transformation. Our civilization is changing now, rapidly and in ways we do not fully understand. Will the institutions we have built to preserve knowledge survive the change? Or will they fall as the library did? That depends on choices we make now, on whether we continue to value knowledge for its own sake, on whether we fund preservation adequately, on whether we resist the politicization of learning, on whether we think in terms of centuries rather than years. The library should haunt us, not because we can prevent its loss, that is impossible, but because we can prevent the same thing from happening to what we have built. We can learn from the mistakes that let the library die. We can choose differently. We can build institutions that are more resilient. We can create redundancy so that no single fire or war or political change can destroy everything. We can foster values that prioritize preservation across generations. We can resist the short-term thinking that sacrifices the future for the present. The scholars of Alexandria could not imagine their library disappearing. It had stood for centuries. It seemed permanent. It seemed too important to ever be lost. They were wrong. And we will be wrong too if we assume our knowledge is safe, simply because we have so much of it. Because quantity is not the same as preservation. There is one final lesson from the Library of Alexandria, perhaps the most important one. Knowledge is not neutral. It is not simply information sitting on shelves waiting to be discovered. Knowledge is created and preserved by human choices. It reflects the values and priorities of those who gather it. The library chose what to collect. It sent agents to certain places and not others. It valued certain types of texts over others. It organized knowledge in particular ways. These choices shaped what survived. They shaped what we inherited from the ancient world. The works we have from classical antiquity are not a random sample. They are the works that the library chose to preserve and copy. The works that later librarians chose to maintain. The works that medieval monks chose to transcribe. The works that Renaissance scholars chose to print. At each stage, choices were made, and those choices determined what we know about the ancient world. We do not have a complete picture. We have the picture that survived a series of selection processes. Each process reflected someone's judgment about what mattered. This is true of all historical knowledge. We know what someone chose to record. We know what someone chose to preserve. We know what someone chose to share. Everything else is silence. This means that when we preserve knowledge, we are making choices. We are deciding what future generations will know about us. We are shaping how they will understand their past. This is an enormous responsibility, and we are not always thoughtful about how we exercise it. We preserve what is convenient, what is already in formats we can easily manage, what fits into our existing categories, what does not challenge our assumptions too much. We neglect what is difficult, what is in formats we do not understand, what comes from communities we do not value, what challenges our preferred narratives. This is how knowledge is lost, not through dramatic destruction, but through quiet neglect, through the accumulation of small decisions to not preserve something. The library made these choices too. It privileged Greek texts over Egyptian ones. It valued philosophy and science over practical crafts. It preserved works by educated elites and ignored popular culture. This means that what we know about the ancient world is biased. We know far more about the thoughts of Greek philosophers than about the daily lives of Egyptian farmers. We know more about military history than about women's experiences. We know more about elite culture than about the vast majority of humanity. The library's choices shaped what survived, and those choices were made by people with particular perspectives and blind spots. We should remember this when we make our own preservation choices. We should ask whose voices are being preserved, whose stories are being told, whose knowledge is being valued. We should work to preserve more broadly, to include perspectives that have historically been excluded, to save materials from communities that lack resources to preserve their own heritage, to recognize that future generations might value things we overlook. The library failed to do this adequately. It was a remarkable institution, but it was also limited by the assumptions of its time. We can do better. We have the resources and the awareness to preserve more inclusively. The question is whether we will. Whether we will make the effort to save knowledge from marginalized communities. Whether we will preserve materials in languages we do not speak. Whether we will document experiences that differ from our own. Whether we will build archives that represent the full diversity of human experience. This is hard work. It requires resources and commitment. It requires overcoming our own biases. It requires listening to communities about what they want preserved. It requires humility about our ability to judge what matters. But it is necessary work, because if we do not do it, we will create our own version of the library's loss. We will preserve a narrow slice of human knowledge and experience. We will leave future generations with a distorted picture of who we were. We will silence voices that deserve to be heard. The Library of Alexandria preserved imperfectly, but it preserved something. It passed on knowledge that would otherwise have been lost completely. We should honor that legacy by doing the same, but doing it better. As we reach the end of this journey through the ruins of memory, you might feel a sense of melancholy. The loss of the library was a tragedy. The knowledge that disappeared can never be fully recovered. The dark ages that followed set humanity back centuries. The dream of universal knowledge the library represented remains unfulfilled. But there is another way to look at this story. The library fell, but the idea of the library survived. The vision of collecting and preserving human knowledge outlasted the institution. Every library built since then is a descendant of Alexandria. Every archive and museum and database carries forward the same mission. The work continues. We gather knowledge, we preserve it for future generations. We make it available to those who seek understanding. We do this because we believe, as the scholars of Alexandria believed, that knowledge matters. That understanding the world is a worthy human endeavor. That each generation has a responsibility to pass on what it has learned. That the accumulated wisdom of humanity is precious and fragile. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but we are still building libraries. Every university library that acquires new materials continues the work. Every digital archive that preserves websites carries forward the mission. Every effort to document endangered languages honors the legacy. Every open-access journal that shares research freely embodies the spirit. We're all librarians of Alexandria now, all of us who believe that knowledge should be preserved and shared. All of us who resist the forces that would destroy or restrict access to information. All of us who think in terms of centuries and civilizations rather than quarters and election cycles. The original library is lost, but the dream is not. And as long as we continue to build and defend institutions that preserve knowledge, the dream lives on. The scrolls of Alexandria are dust, but the words they contained echo still. In the books we read, in the science we practice, in the questions we ask, in the wonder we feel when we learn something new. The library fell because people stopped defending it. They stopped believing it mattered. They chose other priorities. We must not make that mistake. We must defend our libraries and archives and museums. We must fund them adequately. We must resist efforts to censor or politicize them. We must teach our children to value knowledge. We must build for the long term. This is how we honor the scholars who worked in Alexandria. Not by mourning what was lost, but by continuing the work they began, by gathering knowledge, by preserving it, by sharing it freely, by believing that understanding matters more than ignorance. That truth is worth pursuing, that the human project of making sense of the world is noble and necessary. The Library of Alexandria burned, but the fire that drove those scholars still burns in us. The curiosity that made them question, the wonder that made them search, the hope that knowledge could make us better. Rest now, my dear friends. Let the ancient library fade back into shadow. Let the lost scrolls sleep in the darkness. Let the scholars of Alexandria take their rest. Tomorrow you will return to your own libraries, your own searches for understanding, your own work of preservation. But tonight you have walked through the greatest library ever built. You have witnessed its rise and fall. You have learned what it means to lose knowledge, and perhaps you have resolved to defend what remains, to build what comes next, to keep the flame burning. Good night. Sleep well. And remember that every book you save is a scroll rescued from the flames. Every truth you preserve is a victory over the darkness. Every question you ask is a prayer in the temple of the muses. The library is gone, but we remain, and the work continues.